Okay.
Even if it's just a quick hi.
Hello, everybody. Jen and I are talking about meeting up in Chicago next week at the National Restaurant Show. Woohoo! So, everybody, welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. And as you know, if you're watching, this is a special edition of the show because it is Food Allergy Awareness Week. And Jen, I don't know if you noticed, I had teal on for my colors. And because that is the color of food allergy awareness. And so if you see buildings up around wherever you are and they're colored teal, that is why it's Food Allergy Awareness Week. So Jen and I are here to understand, and I'm going to introduce you to her in a second, but talk about the food code and the U.S. food code that we have, and that was changed and implemented in December of 2022. So this lovely lady right here, is Jen Jobrack. She has been in food allergy since 2010. Me too. She served as the Vice President of Advocacy for FAIR, which is the Food Allergy Research and Education Association. And in 2019, she founded Food Allergy Pros to advise hospitality leaders, community groups, schools, and employers on best practices. She is a noted speaker, writer for Allergic Living magazine, board member of the No Nut Traveler, and a food allergy mom herself. So hello, my friend. How are you?
Hi, Tracy. It's so nice to be with you.
Likewise. Really no, I am. I'm a huge fan, and we have been connected for a long time. When I ran one of the fair walks a long time ago.
A long time ago. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Our paths have crossed multiple times professionally, and I know we've shared some of our personal stories with respect to loving people with food allergy, living with food allergy. So yeah.
Yeah, it's, and I need to I'll find, while we're on here, I'll find your past episode because you have been a guest before.
Yes, I have.
And I'm excited to have you on here to talk about the food code because you wrote a fantastic article in Allergic Living on it. And back in January, right? I think, and I will find the link and post that here for everybody as well. But I do want to talk about, especially during Food Allergy Awareness Week, I want to talk about it because there were some changes to the food code that really are opportunities for, food allergic families, but also, there's some industry challenges with it. So can we start with what exactly is the food code?
I was hoping you would ask me to start there.
Okay.
This is the 30th year, 2023, of the Food and Drug Administration coming up with a compendium of best practices in food safety. When the food code first was created, it was there. It's not. Let me back up. It's been way more than 30 years since we've had regulations in this country related to food safety.
Okay.
But 1993 was the first time that all those regulations were sort of put together into a document. Back then it was a physical document, right? With how to keep foods properly refrigerated, how to dispose of waste, what the hygiene should be of the people handling the food, and with respect to hand washing or wearing a hairnet.
Right.
What's the proper temperature to cook chicken to, for instance, right? All of these things that were best practice in keeping our food supplies safe, and free from pathogens and other harmful agents. So it could be, keeping out listeria, but could also be keeping out shards of glass if a bottle breaks. How do you get rid of that? Well, for those of us living with food allergies, the biggest food hazard we often face are allergens, undeclared, unintended allergens in our food. And I should say the food code historically, in more recent years, has been updated every 4 years. And I'll get to what happens to it later in a moment.
Okay.
But it didn't really mention anything about allergens until about 8 years ago.
Okay.
Now, once the food code is adopted, by the Food and Drug Administration. It is the official food code of record, right? So you start with 1993, updated quadrennially. I'm saying that wrong, I'm sure.
Wow, I've never heard that word.
Every 4 years, right?
Uh-huh.
And the 2021 version was delayed because of COVID and the inability for people to meet for purposes of determining the contents of the food code. It is very unusual for anything, once it's in the food code, to be removed, but each iteration adds more stuff. It is then available to state regulators. I should say state and U.S. territory regulators,
okay,
to adopt or to not adopt as they see fit. And every state handles it differently. We know that South Dakota, for instance, South Dakota adopted, I think, the 1996 food code. That was the last time they've updated. And we already know that Pennsylvania, Mississippi, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico have adopted the 2022 food code. And most states are, in between, right? So 14 states are currently living with the 2017 food code. I believe 16 states are living with the 2013 food code. These are all data from the FDA itself. They keep track of what version of the food code state is using. And there are 64 regulatory bodies across the country that have some say in a state's food code. Some states only have one agency regulating their food code and their food safety overall, and others have two, and in some cases even three, depending on whether the product is an agricultural item or an alcohol item or a grocery item or restaurant product. So it's a hodgepodge, and it's a regulatory jigsaw puzzle trying to figure out who's doing what. But the importance of the food code is that it is the FDA, and with input from many stakeholders. I was privileged to serve on the Conference for Food Protection, which advises FDA on the food code, and which comprises food safety experts, consumer experts, grocery and hospitality representatives. There are lay people with professional expertise who are advising the FDA on how to keep food safe. And then the FDA takes those recommendations, puts it all together into the food code, puts it out in the world, and crosses its fingers. The FDA does not have any regulatory oversight in what happens once the food code is implemented in a given state.
Okay.
And the one other thing I should say, sorry, I'm giving you a very long answer.
No, I love it.
Is that a state can decide which food code to use. There is no requirement that it update to the most recent version. And it can also decide which elements of a food code to adopt. So
there
have been, it is. And we'll talk in a moment, I'm sure, about the improvements for the folks who are concerned about food allergy. And what we can do to get those components in every food code across the country. So, okay, I hope that explains what the food code is. If people are really interested, they can go to the FDA's website, and get a whole lot of information. But it's ostensibly, the compendium of best practice, and science-based best practice on food safety, and the overwhelming majority of its contents are not focused on allergens. They're focused on things that you and I deal with in our own kitchens, like how cold should my refrigerator be, and how long should I cook my pot roast?
Right, exactly. And I know that like NC State, where my alma mater, they have a food safety, and Ben Chapman is a food safety expert there. He's doing a lot of like the packaging of talking about chicken, and the liquid in chicken and how it spreads germs around your kitchens and home kitchens.
That's right.
Right. Exactly. Right. So they're doing a lot of research on that. But it is mind-blowing that in so many different ways about how this is implemented and not implemented and enforced across the board.
It is enforced, or I should say, should be enforced at the state level by state regulators. The FDA turns over authority for implementation and oversight to the states.
Okay.
One of the questions I never seem to get a good answer to is what happens if a establishment violates a part of the food code? Are all parts of the food code treated equally? I'm right. sure in your community and our listeners and viewers, you'll see a sign on a restaurant where the restaurant's been shuttered for violating right. food code. Are all components of the food code treated equally? If someone were to ignore an allergen component, would that carry the same right. consequences? Undercooking your chicken. I don't know the answer to that, actually.
Right.
I think it really depends on the agency enforcing it and perhaps even the regulator who's doing the inspection.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and it does bring light. I mean, because in 2014, so it's almost been 10 years since the EU implemented a change to their regulations as it pertains to unpackaged foods. And so, and actually, let me bring up that. So the food code, we talked about the food code, and then this change in 2007 in 2022, one of the biggest changes, or let's just talk about the two biggest changes, is one, that sesame was added into the food code as a top 9 allergen, which came along with the FASTER Act.
Correct.
Which deems sesame as a top allergen. So now there's 9. And then the other significant changes around allergens is that labeling in written form must be provided to consumers of the top 9 allergens, of the major allergens. Correct. Yes. On unpackaged food and bulk food.
Unpackaged previously. So I'm sure you are, and many of your followers are familiar with FALCPA, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004, landmark legislation to require manufacturers of packaged foods to call out and label for the top 8 allergens. And for the most part, oversight of that has been good, meaning that FDA does, they do publish recalls.
Right.
For a long time, the recalls were self-created by manufacturers, but recently FDA has oversight to do recalls. Undeclared allergens are the number one reason for food recall in this country, but it's the language of FALCPA in 2004 up until recently, everything was about packaged food. So the things you find on the grocery shelf. What was omitted from that? The cookie you buy in the in-store bakery counter, the chicken salad you buy behind the deli counter, the pizza place that your fancy grocery store might have in store, and then restaurants, food trucks, anywhere where unpackaged food is sold.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So the food code really applies. If you take the allergen piece out for just a moment, the food code really applies to those places, right? It applies to places where food is prepared on site for immediate consumption. It generally has not been applied to, the cookie company that boxes everything up and puts it on the store shelves. Although there are components of it that, of course, are true for any food production facility. But the food code, the people who are paying attention to it are in the industry that you work with, Tracy, and that I work with, which is, where is food being served right now to be eaten right now? And what the food code in the 2022 version calls for, and I have to say, we worked hard there's some wonderful people who I had the privilege of working with for several years to make this happen, is that any allergen, top 9, that is in a unpackaged food item has to be called out. There are ways it can be called out. It can be listed on a menu. It can be listed on a placard next to the item in the deli counter. It can be listed in a binder that is available upon request. It can be listed on a website behind a QR code. There are all sorts of ways it can be available, but it has to be available.
Right.
And that closes a huge part of food that was unaddressed by Falklight.
Right. Okay. That's a really, really good explanation of that, because, and it's the same thing. I'm going to jump back to the EU again, because in 2014, they adopted something similar, and they let all the member states come up with their own rules and regulations around it, which is similar to what we do with all of our states, right?
Mm-hmm.
To do that. And then, so that closed that loop, and then they're still closing loopholes on that law. The UK has, adopted the Natasha's law.
Right.
Mm-hmm. To close the loophole on food prepared on site, wrapped up, and then sold in like refrigerated refrigerated thing.
Right. Or stuck in a bag, because you custom made order stuck in a bag. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So but it has to be the important thing here, and I think, Natasha's law, although it applies not to the US, when there have been, and unfortunately there have been, fatalities, right?
Right.
A lot of it has been, as I think about them, when someone ate food they weren't supposed to, and I use that term not to blame the person, but to say there was an allergen in it.
Right.
The information was communicated verbally.
Mm-hmm.
If the information is communicated in writing, it allows for the food preparer, the people who know the recipe, to take a beat and say, we've got to write all this down. If you're relying on a kid who's working at a ice cream stand over the summer, who may or may not retain whatever training he or she got, verbally things get lost, right?
Right.
It allows for someone perhaps to purchase food on someone else's behalf, because they can read the ingredient label and say, okay, Johnny can have this.
Right.
And it, I think, compels food providers to really think about, what are the ingredients in their food? So, and some consumers might not know how food is made, and that now they do. Right. They might not know that the mayonnaise in that chicken salad contains egg.
Right.
And now they see it contains egg listed on the label, and it's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
And that will hopefully help those people who think mayonnaise contains dairy, because it doesn't.
That's another podcast.
That is another podcast. Yes, exactly. But and that's the important part. And when you're going to meetings and events, there's so much food that is, or in having a meeting at a restaurant, there's so much food that is not. You read this nice, beautiful, deliciously sounding menu item, and it's not labeled, right? And so you don't know. And I did meet somebody a couple of weeks ago, or was chatting with somebody, and I mentioned the food code had been updated, and he's like, well, no, that's the he was mentioning the Food Allergy Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. I'm like, no, the 2022 food code was updated. My friend Nancy's like, you better have your knowledge together, Tracy, because he's going to push you back. And I'm like, I know my knowledge is right, because this is done. But he's like, we're going to rely, instead of writing it down, we're going to rely on our servers, to educate our servers on what we're serving, and which makes me cringe. And Shandy Turnow of Certistar, I know that makes her cringe as well. And we actually both need to see her while we're at National Restaurant Show next week, because she will be exhibiting, makes her turn now, because with staffing shortages right now,
right.
why would you want to put that? You then have to educate every single person every single day, right?
It's already hard enough.
Right.
Back when I worked for FAIR, we partnered with some folks doing restaurant training, and I still do some work in that space. And the biggest complaint, even before COVID, the high percentage of turnover. Sometimes even before COVID, 150% of your staff might turn over, and relying on servers, busboys, hosts to know and retain allergen information, which could be changing daily if substitutions are required, if recipes change. It's asking an awful. It's a very heavy lift for staff. Not that they can't do it. It really depends on the establishment. If it's a seasonal place where you're hiring teenagers for 6 weeks or 2 months, it might not be a realistic lift versus a restaurant that's been around forever with professional wait staff and the menu that hasn't changed. But regardless, the food code says it needs to be in writing for a reason.
Right.
And I think it's going to be a very interesting, potentially dramatic change for the operations of a restaurant.
Right.
Which is, remains to be seen who else will adopt. Pennsylvania, as we talked about before we went live today, Pennsylvania has chosen to adopt the 2022 code with that component in it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Exactly.
So, those of you listening from Pennsylvania, keep an eye out. When does it go into effect? And do you start seeing more allergen labeling in your supermarket?
Right. Exactly. And I will put that link on what I found on that, because I did find a letter that was sent to food facility operators. That is who it is addressed to. So I actually sent it to a caterer friend in Philadelphia to see if he received it, because it'll be really interesting to know, what he has seen and what they're doing about it. But it is, I'm curious, when you were working on that committee, were there food service operators on that committee as well?
Yes.
And they were for this.
We worked in committees. We worked in subcommittees. So those of us who cared about allergens sort of found each other, right? Worked on those particular planks. There was definitely, some pushback about feasibility of keeping track of all the ingredients and allergens and substitutions that might reveal new allergens. But I think that's true in any large committee process, right? But we got it through. I was no longer on the Conference for Food Protection when it passed. I was on a couple of years earlier when it took, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years for that thing to finally make it. It's a slow process. Let me put it that way. So I can't say that I was in the room when it was voted on, but I can tell you from earlier dialogue, the other piece was getting people. There are, as you mentioned to your colleague, there are people who focus on food safety. This is what they do. They teach it in university. They are food inspectors. They work for food manufacturers. Getting the food safety industry to recognize allergens as a food hazard, that education in and of itself took over a decade, right? Getting people to put undeclared walnut in the same category, or perhaps an even higher level of concern than a pathogen.
Right.
And trying to explain that, a pathogen might make you really sick. It could kill you. Okay. But if you're allergic to walnut and you have that bite, it could kill you or cause you serious illness very quickly, like within minutes. So, we still have a lot of work to do to get the people that are doing the inspections to see that this is right up there with those other foodborne concerns.
Okay. Well, we have a lot to work to do on it across the board. I mean, I understand that, and I think this is a nice step forward. And as you said in your article, it's very hopeful for the food allergic community. And we've talked a little bit about some of those limitations, and like one, the states get to pick and choose what they want to adopt from the food code, the U.S. Food Code, when they start to implement this, and their actual following up of it, right? To make sure that, meaning those food safety inspectors, getting around to reaching everybody, right?
Right. And that's like many other fields, that's been affected by staffing changes as well.
Right. Exactly. And I know when I was chatting with an attorney in Italy with their code, I'm like, well, small mom and pops. Well, if they don't have an attorney, then they don't know about it. Right. So it's like, Right.
Even I would imagine most states have a grace period. I don't know what it is one by one, but I think most states would say, you don't hit every new component of the food code right away on,
right.
say,
but that's got to be very hard. Right.
So consumers have a role to play also, though. And that is,
so explain that. Yeah.
If you care about this issue, and I sure do, you do.
Yep.
First of all, educate yourself. It's not that hard to, every state government has its own website with search function, for better or for worse. Some are better than others, about, food safety. Google food safety, California. Well, California's not a good example, but, I live in Illinois, food safety, Illinois. And you'll start to see the names of the agencies that regulate food safety in your community, in your state. They don't hear from consumers very often. So when they do, they kind of prick up their ears. And you say, you can even go, maybe we can put it in the chat, Tracy, the FDA chart of which version of the food code your state.
I did. Yep.
Okay, good. Perfect. Yep. And, find out if your state is not using a food code, that's, I'd say at least 2017, but hopefully 2022, because of the changes we're talking about. Who do you talk to? I mean, it's not a legislative decision. So your state rep or your state senator may have some influence in helping you figure out how to advocate for the state to adopt the food code. But it's largely in the hands of regulators, who are mostly anonymous to most of us. We don't vote for them. We're not involved in their selection. Some of them have been in that position for decades, maybe appointed, by someone who's no longer in office. But I think it's important to educate yourself first about what version of the food code your state uses, and what the steps might be to influence whether you are part of a food allergy support group, and your support group can reach out en masse, whether they're the regulators or folks who take meetings with constituents and residents of that state. We've taken it to this point where it's now federal policy, but it's not federal law.
Okay.
And I just want to emphasize that again. This is not a legislative statutory piece. This is a guideline promulgated by FDA for purposes of states using it as their own best practice benchmarking, not a law.
Right.
So no one's breaking the law by not using the most recent version of the food code. Almost every state requires that they use a version of the food code. So does that make sense?
It does. It does and it doesn't. But
right. Fair.
Well, and I was doing some research for a client, looking for a caterer for her daughter's bat mitzvah. And I know you just celebrated a bar mitzvah. So congratulations. And hers is next year. And she's like, do you have any caterers in the Philadelphia area that can do this? And I actually found a caterer who on their website actually had all of their menu items with a key code, actually not a key code, a spreadsheet. And it didn't list all 9 allergens, but it did have vegetarian, vegan, and like 5 of the top 9 allergens. Right. And I'm like, wow. And I sent it to her. I'm like, here's, one caterer that I know, and we've been talking about your event, but here's another one that I found this on their website.
Right.
So
that's terrific to see that.
Yeah. I mean, because
I mean,
somebody's going to buy from them first.
And that's the other thing is that another way, I'm glad you mentioned that, because another way for consumers to express themselves is to go to the vendors they love and say, look, this is now something that is expected of food preparers, food handlers, food retailers. And, we know this already in other industries that food allergy families return again and again and again to the reliable brands who are transparent in their ingredient disclosure and who treat their customers' allergy concerns with respect and accurate information.
Right.
Some fast food chains have already done this for years, actually. The thing that you just mentioned, there are a few that will publish a grid of everything from their sodium count to their the presence of the top 9. I've seen that recently. A few national household names as well do that. So, is it difficult? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it difficult to get it started? Yeah, maybe, because you have to sort of audit the ingredients of all your food. But then to keep it's just a matter of these same restaurants. What one would hope would, if their refrigerator went on the fritz, they would immediately deal with it, right? They would throw out the food that's bad. They would get the repair person in there. They might even have to close for a day. They would treat it seriously, and they would invest in the equipment to keep the food at the appropriate temperature and avoid pathogens.
Right.
So we know that people in the hospitality industry, who are, of course, one would hope, are there to be hospitable and to welcome people with grace, with graciousness, that they just have to work this into their SOPs. Yep. Like, this is part of what it means to run a restaurant. You disclose your allergens.
Right.
And like everything in life, when it's new, it feels uncomfortable, and after a while you get used to it, and it's okay.
Right. Exactly. Well, and it's funny because I was teaching a class at Exhibitor Show in Louisville a couple of weeks ago. And I got an email from one of the attendees, a meeting planner. He's like, I'm on site with this event. I've got my banquet event orders. This is what I'm asking. I'm asking for them to identify the allergens that my attendees have on the banquet event order and on the labels. And that event manager, catering services manager, whatever that person is called at a hotel, is like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And it is because it's a lot of work to put it into that banquet event order. And we actually he even wanted them to spell out, because I don't know how familiar you are with a banquet event order, but typically when a hotel or a convention center lists it, it says, okay, this is what's on the buffet, right? And then down at the bottom, it says 25 vegetarian, 4 gluten-free, 3 shellfish allergies. They don't tell you what they're serving them. They just tell you that this is how many of those that we're going to serve. And I'm like, no, this is a contract. Right. You're okay spelling out everything else that you're going to put on that banquet buffet, but I need you to spell out this other thing, because to me, that's just chef, the whim of the day, making this food for that person. And I don't know, I'm not comfortable with not knowing what you're serving.
That's right. Yep. And I think I will say, having been in this world professionally for 13 years and been in it personally for 18 years, as my soon-to-be high school graduate is the person who, got me into this. But there's been an enormous improvement overall in the availability of allergen-safe food, certainly in the grocery store. The level of awareness among those who serve food, be it a restaurant who serves the food directly, or a school or college campus that brings in a food service company, that awareness is so much better than it used to be.
Right.
My son's future college campus, their dining halls are completely nut-free. They're comfortable declaring that. They've toured me. It's impressive that they now some people would say, well, that's not the real world. That's okay. I'm all right. He's going to have plenty of time in the real world. Let him have a few years where he doesn't have to worry about his food. And I think just like we never, I think people, our foremothers who advocated generations ago may not have anticipated the level of disclosure and transparency that there is now. The number one food safety rule if you're living with food allergies is to know what you're about to put in your mouth.
Right.
And if you don't know it, don't eat it. And if it's unlabeled, don't eat it until you absolutely have verification. And unfortunately, as we said earlier, there have been instances, actually 3 or 4 that I'm aware of off the top of my head in this country, of course, Natasha in the UK, where people did ask and were given information verbally about an item, and it turned out to be inaccurate information, wrong information.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So we've made great strides. There's more to do. I'm happy with how far we've come, but not content with how much farther we need to go.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work to do, but I like what you said is that it is daunting to get started. But, once you get started and you think about it, and I was talking to Simon from Y Boston, Simon McMahon from Y Boston, and he's in the UK, but with their regulation, they're also have to put in the calories counts and everything on their foods as well. But they change their menus because they're like, we love this dish, but holy crap, how much calories does it have?
Mm-hmm.
And how bad is it for you? So they ended up, by doing that, they were like, oh my gosh, wow, how can we rework this menu item so it's not so caloric or unhealthy for our attendees, right?
That's an unintended benefit, right?
Exactly.
Unanticipated benefit, right?
Yeah. So, and I'm planning a menu for an event next month, and going through, and I just I've talked about this a couple of times now, is looking at their appetizer menu. They have 30 appetizers on the combined on cold and hot, and 83% of them contain gluten. And the two that are gluten-free, dairy-free, I think that's just on the hot, both contain pork. And I know pork's not a top allergen, but pork is a big issue for a lot of people,
Yes.
who don't eat meat,
there's a number of faiths who do not eat pork. Yes.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do when I go is like, hey, I was looking at your menu items and just look at it differently. Right. And that's what I do for a lot of my clients is like, okay, this is the menu you picked. But when I sort it by the individuals who have different dietary restrictions, the gluten-free, dairy-free person gets to eat guacamole, right? Or the vegan gets to eat ketchup, right? So looking at it from that perspective, that's a little bit more eye-opening to say, hey, wow, I didn't, we thought of all these great menu items, but we didn't think about it from the overall holistic view. Yeah.
I would hope that engaging with your own ingredient list, writing it down, and I just said, sort of laying it side by side with everything else in your deli counter or on your menu, on your buffet. I think some of that you're not thinking about, and then you're doing the task of labeling everything, going, wait a minute, we have a problem here. The person who's allergic to soy can have salad with no dressing, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe we don't need to put soy in that dressing. Maybe we can make it without.
Right. Whatever. Or we can not buy the prepackaged soy dressing or the salad dressing, right? Make our own fresh, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So you've been doing this. I mean, well, you just actually kind of said it. This is a very impactful change to this food code.
Yes.
And do you see that impactful change? I mean, we've kind of already touched on this, but I really want to reiterate it. I'm like, how positive do you think it's going to be taken positively?
So, I think, first of all, it's positive because the people in positions of decision making are now recognizing allergens as a food safety issue, which was not the case more than a decade ago.
Right.
Okay. So that bodes well for the future of food safety with respect to food allergens. It bodes well for people who are leading food companies or working their way through the ranks of regulators and decision makers and policy makers. They're getting that they have to think about allergens too.
Right.
It's not this side ancillary issue that it was as recently as, 6 or 7 years ago.
Right.
So that's great. It's also an important moment because it includes an area, a corner of food service, not such a small corner, I might add, a huge part of food service.
Big.
That has been untouched by allergen regulation in the past, an allergen statute. And while it may take a while for consumers to see that impact, because it may take a while for states to adopt, implement, educate, enforce those changes, it over time will have significant impact. Think about the states that now have restaurant laws about food allergens.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, this does not replace those laws. This adds to them. Many of those laws say things like, please alert, they have to put a note on the menu, please alert your server if you have food allergies. Purpose of that statement could be seen two ways. One is it sort of puts the onus on the consumer to bring it up. Okay. The other way to look at it is it forces a conversation about allergens and helps the kitchen maybe clarify and refine its own methods and ingredients. But it's taken a while for that to become, much more common practice. These things don't happen quickly. As I said, Food Code, 5 years passed between 2017 and 2022. The next Food Code will probably be back on a 4-year schedule. These things take a lot of time.
Yep.
But I think over time we will see more labeling of non-packaged foods and more awareness on the part of those preparing those foods.
Right. And I'm glad. I mean, it's definitely a really big step forward, 100%. And it's thinking about things. And Sarah Matheson, do you know Sarah from Hungry Harry? She's in Chicago. So she was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about her getting funding, right? And to do her prepackaged food, to move it to the next level, because it's free of the top 14 allergens. But it is a conversation that I think food manufacturers have, as well as what our retail side of that caterers are going to say is like, well, we're not a free from environment, right? Or they don't want to buy the equipment or have the capacity to buy the equipment to do a separate line, right? Or a separate, do the free from line and then do this. So it's finding those environments. So it is thinking of a restaurant, what food safety steps can I take to make sure that this is free of sesame or free of soy,
or just label it.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the food code does not say anywhere you have to rid your establishment of the top 9 allergens.
Mm-hmm.
It just says, put it on a label, put it in a binder, put it on a sticker. Let us know.
Right.
And I think there are people who fear, oh my gosh, the government's going to make me change my recipes. No, that's not true at all.
Right.
The idea is just know what you're serving and communicate that to your customer. And then the customer can make up his or her own mind. And there may be instances where someone goes to a buffet and can only eat the guacamole. That will probably happen.
Right.
But at least that person can feel confident that they can eat the guacamole. And there's not some hidden, I don't know, fish oil in that guacamole, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not about changing ingredients. It's about disclosing them.
That's a really, really good point. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think Shandy does a really good job with that with Certistar as well, because she's like, I just want you to be transparent about how you're cooking it, what the ingredients are, so that when we add your menu items to Certistar, somebody is confident in reading what it is, right? And I know there's another app there that we need to, at the restaurant show, that we need to check out too, is Galley. But it's just 100% transparency. Right. And
completely.
Yeah.
And look, as consumers, we are, as I said before, we are our own first line of safety. You have to read the ingredients every time.
Right.
And if you don't feel confident, don't read it. Don't eat it. If there's no ingredient label, don't eat it. And I'm talking about food you eat, not the food you're making yourself, but yeah. And I hope that this eliminates, or at least dramatically minimizes, the mistakes, because unfortunately people have suffered dear consequences from mistakes.
Right, exactly. And that's the truth. It's like, we want to educate that don't go take the salad back and take the croutons off and that's a mistake, right? Go make a fresh salad without the croutons on it, things like that. So, okay. So my final question for you,
yes, ma'am,
which I ask everybody, is what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive dining experience mean to you?
Well, I think I've already tipped my hand on this one. It's about transparency in ingredient information. I would like to see, in a perfect world, every single ingredient listed or available to for inspection by anyone who's interested. No more proprietary ingredients. No more,
keep going.
Okay. That's fine. I'd like to see the requests of people who have food allergies and other medical dietary conditions treated seriously and with respect. And I do not want people to guess if an item is safe. Or I'd like to see an inclusive experiences where the chef and the people who serve you take the time to listen carefully to what it is that you're asking. If I ask you if this item, this has happened to us, does this have peanuts in it? Oh yeah, it's gluten-free.
Yeah.
Right. I think listening in all areas of life yields great results. And food allergic customers want to know that if they raise this issue, which is often uncomfortable to raise, you're revealing intimate medical information to a complete stranger, and you're entrusting them with your life.
Right.
And I think sometimes a hurried, rushed, understaffed team of servers, well-meaning and kind people as they may not be stopping to listen to what the questions are really about. So an inclusive experience is one where people feel heard and chefs are involved. And even if a chef comes out, which has happened to us, and said, let me hear about your allergies. What are you interested in ordering? I can assure you that this is made separately, or you know what, maybe you shouldn't have that thing. That's to me what an inclusive experience looks like.
That's awesome. Well, and I was looking for this because you mentioned having the allergens or the full ingredients available. As I did an event, and it was in Atlanta, and I worked with Levy restaurant groups at the convention center, and we had laminated cards. And I did this. I got all the ingredients for the event because we had 15,000 people in Centennial Olympic Park, but I had it on a little ringed thing, right, so that the head catering people could have it there to actually show to people, hey, these are the allergens, or this is the ingredients in it if you want to research what it is, right? So that it was readily available, because we weren't inside the convention center, we were in a park, right? So that's doing that, yeah. And I love that. Yeah.
That's great. I'll tell you a tiny little anecdote. This past Saturday, I was asked to run the bake sale at my son's Boy Scout troop pancake breakfast. And I said, I will do it on one condition. I want everyone to label whatever they bring, preferably with all ingredients, but at a minimum with these allergens. And I listed the top 9. And to my great delight, everybody came with their allergens listed. That didn't
Awesome.
happen 2 years ago. And consequently, we were able to sort things by, the nut stuff was here, the gluten-free was here, and everything was individually wrapped. There was no sharing of serving pieces.
Right.
I was so happy. And the kids who couldn't buy this but could buy that were so happy. Now, another conversation to be had about bake sales and, do we trust what people do in their own kitchens? That's but
Right.
It was baby steps, right? It was baby
Right.
steps. Getting people to label their allergens. I was tickled. And hopefully we can do even better next year.
Yeah. I mean, and that is
fairness. The people who are not affected by food allergy, recognizing that it affects the people they're trying to serve.
Right. And even asking that question of those people making the food in their kitchen, they may have been a little bit more aware of what they were doing.
I'm sure that's true. One mom said to me, she normally makes these brownies with walnuts and she just left them out. So great.
Novel idea, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. So, okay. Well, everybody, we have been talking, Jen and I have been talking about the updated food code. If, listening here, and there's links in all of the chats and all of the social media here that you can look at to see what the food code is in your current state, or in the state that you're in, and check that out. And I've put a link to the Apple version of Jen's original podcast episode, episode 101, in the chat as well, talking about just food allergy laws. So check us out and let us both know. And Jen, I've put up here everybody can find you at food-allergy-pros.com.
Thank you.
You're welcome. She is in Chicago Central Time. Yes. So everybody pay attention to that too. But
I'm up very early.
Well, and I emailed you way late, but so thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
It is absolutely a pleasure to be with you again, Tracy. And this is the work that I do. This is my life's work. I love it. And it's, there's much more to do. And I always welcome having conversations with people that are interested in learning more.
Yeah, likewise. And I will see you at the restaurant show. I'm getting next week. So we definitely need to meet up and do a selfie together and share what we're seeing at the show.
Absolutely. We'll reach out to you on that as well. Thank you so much for having me today. Really grateful.
Oh, you're welcome. And everybody, tomorrow is the regular time for the Eating at a Meeting podcast at 12 o'clock noon. And I'm actually talking to Allergy Dragon chef Martha Morgan out of Louisville. She's a professional chef, cooking since the age of 16. And in her 40s got diagnosed with celiac disease and food allergies, but she became a food allergy mom 6 years prior to that as well. So she's going to talk to you about techniques and ways to do what we're talking about today, Jen. But that's 12 o'clock Eastern tomorrow. So check us out. And by the way, I'm doing some food. Be your guest on Wednesday or on Thursday. We're going to avoid wheat and spend the day not eating wheat to see what your guests have to experience when you're doing that. So more on that coming up. But Jen, thank you again so much for being here, and everybody stay safe and eat well. Jen, stay online with me for a second. Until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks.